So one of the things that makes soccer so fun is the vast history of rivalries and derbies around the world that give every team and every league its distinct flavor and its distinct narratives. Usually when you think of rivalries and derbies, you imagine pairings of teams. Two teams from the same city or region, or two clubs that are the most successful, or two clubs with a particular socio-political history. However, in some places, these rivalry dynamics are sort of shaken up by a third party, or a third wheel. Those third parties can disrupt a rivalry either by just being really good, or having a hatred of their own for the two rivaling parties, so let's discuss some of them. We'll start close to home for me. I've talked about how as a Vancouver Whitecaps fan, I sometimes feel like a third wheel in our own rivalry series. In North American soccer, the oldest rivalry in the league is that of the pro teams of the Cascadia region, the northwest of the continent. The Vancouver Whitecaps, the Portland Timbers, and the Seattle Sounders all three have a deep history for North American standards, as well as examples of on-field excellence. Their supporter scenes were sort of ahead of their time for the MLS, and are still among the best in the continent today. However, Portland and Seattle, both being American, sort of made it so a lot more hatred is focused on each other than the Whitecaps, as the Whitecaps are from Canada, therefore needing a border crossing every time they visit. They still dislike the Whitecaps, don't get me wrong, but most fans of Portland and Seattle would probably say that their disdain for each other takes precedent. Vancouver is also unique in this situation because since the 21st century began, they shadow two rivalries. The other is much lower priority for most Whitecaps fans, but considering how often we meet each other in the Voyageurs Cup, aka Canada's cup competition, some bad blood is bound to be felt. The only other Canadian teams in the MLS are Toronto FC and CF Montreal. Now, like in every sport, Montreal and Toronto focus a lot of their disdain for each other, but Vancouver being the third Canadian team sort of made it so that the league itself tried to push Vancouver as a rival to Toronto and Montreal. I personally am pretty indifferent to Toronto and Montreal, but we meet so often in cup competition and league competition that it does get competitive amongst fans at times. And as Canadian soccer has continued to evolve, now having its own league for both men and women, the Whitecaps, TFC, and Montreal will always be intrinsically linked as the three professional outliers in this country, playing in a foreign league, and as pro teams that blaze the trail for Canadian soccer leagues to follow, such as the Canadian Premier League, the Northern Super League, and League One Canada. So long story short, Vancouver has the interesting distinction of being a third wheel in two separate rivalries. Now let's go to Europe and discuss some of its interesting third wheel situations. Starting in Turkey, where one of the most famous and exciting rivalries in the world is hosted. Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, the two Istanbul giants known across the world not only for their on-field excellence, but for their scintillating supporter scene. Now these two teams clash over a lot of things. On-field supremacy, politics and conspiracies, a history of violent incidents. But there's a third Istanbul giant that hates Galatasaray and Fenerbahce for a lot of the same reasons. My favorite team in Turkey, Besiktas JK, they are the third most successful team in the Turkish Super League with 16 league titles and 11 cup titles to their name as well. They have just as many fans and their atmosphere is just as vibrant and loud. While Gala and Fener definitely dislike each other more, they can never afford to count out Besiktas, who have matched them on basically every metric. Let's head to Portugal. This one is interesting because the third wheel in this instance is quite far from the other two rivals. And in the case of Porto, they actually have more league titles than one of them. The two main rival parties in this discussion are Benfica and Sporting Club, two of the three most illustrious clubs in Portugal, from the same city of Lisbon. The third being Porto, who are 3 hours away from Lisbon. Porto actually has 30 league titles to Sporting's 21, while Benfica tops them both with 38 league titles. However, Benfica and Sporting, being essentially right on each other's doorstep, and with the two sharing an old class-based dynamic, they were usually far more focused on each other. Although to be fair, the class dynamic is far less pronounced these days as in most of the world of soccer. And Porto can match Benfica in European excellence, and player recruitment, fan turnout, all of that. But there's always something about sharing a city with another team that takes your rivalry to the next level. And since Sporting is also one of the best in the country, and always in contention to win titles, I imagine Benfica fans feel a lot more ill will towards Sporting, and excitement for the big Lisbon rivalry has to be a little higher than whenever Porto come to town. The last one in Europe I'll mention briefly is the rivalry situation in Athens. Most non-Greek soccer fans, when asked about Greek football, will automatically know about the historic Olympiakos-Panathinaikos rivalry. Olympiakos hailing from the outskirts of the city in Piraeus, a distinct region of its own, and Panathinaikos in the city proper. Historically, Olympiakos and Panathinaikos are the two most successful teams in Greek history, although Olympiakos has a lot more recent league success. Panathinaikos, shout out to my favorite team in Greece, is still competitive and has won the Greek Cup in recent years. But despite the gap in success between the two teams and another pretty intense derby in the Thessaloniki derby between PAOK and Eris, the derby of the eternal enemies remains special, and Greece's most well known. But there's another great club in Athens, with more recent league success than Panathinaikos. That is AEK Athens, one of the most well-supported and vibrant fan bases in the country. A team with 13 league titles of their own and 16 cup titles, both coming most recently in 2023. While recent success for both sides might make the Olympiakos and AEK match more exciting, and both AEK and Panathinaikos being in Athens proper is always an intense match, something about the derby of the eternal enemies is just another level. Perhaps if Panathinaikos take any longer to win the league again, their latest being 2010, and if AEK can remain consistent enough, this dynamic will change. But for now, Olympiakos and Panathinaikos is where it's at. Now let's head to Africa, in one of the continent's most incredible footballing destinations, Egypt. Now even some non-Egyptian fans know about the incredible derby between Al Ahly and Zamalek, Cairo and Egypt's two most successful and well-supported teams. Al Ahly is widely considered the people's club, as it is adored by people in Egypt all over, and is consistently portrayed and praised in Egyptian media and fiction. It is one of the most successful men's football teams, full stop, regardless of continent. And it's not that they've had an easy ride. They share a continent with other great footballing nations such as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana, and probably others I'm not mentioning. It's a great continent for the sport. Nonetheless, they are the most illustrious team in Africa, with the most African Champions Leagues to their name as well. Their great rivals, Zamalek, who represent both the historic city of Giza and Cairo itself, are no slouches either, winning 14 league titles and 5 Champions League crowns of their own, and 2 Confederation Cups, those being the African equivalent of the Europa League, as well as 1 Arab Club Championship from 2003. And when Al Ahly and Zamalek meet each other, the nation stands still. But now, some major money has disrupted this dynamic. Pyramids FC are the Manchester City of Egypt, rising fast into the ranks of Egyptian and African football with seemingly limitless wealth. Founded under a different name 120 kilometers away from Cairo and Beni Suef in 2008. 10 years later, that team was bought out and brought to Cairo by a massive Saudi investment. They became Pyramids FC and immediately went for the jugular of Al Ahly and Zamalek. The ownership changed a few years later, but the massive wealth remained as the team was taken over by an Emirati group instead. Finally, in 2024, the club got gold and won the Egyptian Cup. This seemingly opened the floodgates, and this year in 2025, they defeated the Mamelodi Sundowns to win the African Champions League. However, despite the massive budget and the seemingly inevitable successes down the road, Pyramids FC has an uphill battle to fight in terms of winning support, as right now they're seen as more of a nuisance in the city than a team to legitimately support. For the most part. They do have some supporters, but it pales in comparison to the others. They moved into a city which has 2-century-old teams that have defined soccer in the nation and the continent, with their support being incredible, not only in Cairo, but in all of Egypt and even the Egyptian diaspora abroad. Plus, as an organization, they are barely over a decade old, and as a Cairo team, not even a decade old. And in a country with teams as old or older than the modern nation of Egypt itself, such as the aforementioned Ahly and Zamalek, Ismaili SC, Al-Ittihad, and Al-Masri, Pyramids is going to be contending with a lack of support even with on-field success for some time. Al-Ahly and Zamalek is a derby that has defined Egyptian soccer and culture, and all the money in the world might not help Pyramids muscle into that. Staying in the Arab world, but going to the Asian side, we go to the nation of my background, Jordan. Now in Jordan, the two main clubs which mostly maintain a monopoly on most titles are Amman's Al Faisali and Al Wahdat. It wasn't always this way, however. Other Amman clubs such as Al Ahli and Al Jazeera were the two teams dominating the league from 1947 to 58. But then, in 1959, Al Faisali won their first league title in nearly 15 years to that point. From there, they never looked back, dominating the league for nearly 20 years. Then in 1980, Al Wahdat won their first league title. Then the next 25 years were spent in a constant hot potato game between Al Wahdat and Al Faisali. However, while that was happening, Amman's Shabab Al Ordon were formed in 2002. And no club disrupted Wahdat and Faisali as hard as Shabab Al Ordon did in the late 2000s and early 2010s. As far as I could find out, Shabab Al Ordon are the soccer department of the Al Qadsiya Sports Club in Amman. Shortly after their soccer program went professional, they won the 2006 Jordanian League title. 1 year later, they won the 2007 AFC Cup, Asia's equivalent of the Europa League, by defeating two-time defending champions, fellow Jordanian rival Al Faisali in the final. They continued to pester and annoy Faisali and Wahdat in subsequent league campaigns before winning their second league title in 2013. Their latest title win was the 27 Jordanian Shield, sort of Jordan's equivalent to the League Cup. Their form has cooled significantly in recent years, but nonetheless they've been a consistent feature in the Jordanian League and never a fun visit for any Jordanian club. Wahdat and Faisali are commonly fixated on each other, but they always have to look over their shoulder for their weird little brother, the one that lags behind in fan support and is several decades younger than they are, but they know every once in a while that they can surprise you. All three of these Amman giants are playing second, third, and fourth fiddle to Al Hussein out of Irbid, who have won the last two league titles. But if history is any indication, these clubs won't go down quietly. Now, there are more examples of football third wheels, but since we don't want to be here all day, we can give some quick shout-outs to some other notable ones, such as Mexico, where Mexico City club Pumas is very well supported, but is on the outside looking into the Clásico Joven, the famous derby between Club America and Cruz Azul. There's Atletico Madrid on the outskirts of the Clásico rivalry, Middlesbrough and the Newcastle-Sunderland rivalry. You can make any sort of argument for Juve, AC Milan, and Inter Milan. You could talk about Lokomotiv Moscow on the outside of the Spartak CSKA rivalry, and Saudi Arabia's Al Shabab looking into the Al Nasr Al Hilal rivalry in Riyadh. This is such a unique situation in this sport, and I always find these sort of three-way rivalries, or even 4 or 5-way rivalries, depending on the league you're talking about, super interesting. There's almost like a hierarchy of dislike, in every league between teams. It's really interesting. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.